Captain Sarah Ghost Mitchell never expected that reading a worn paperback copy of The Art of War during her off-duty hours would lead to one of the most extraordinary rescue missions in modern military aviation history. It was a typical Tuesday afternoon at Ramstein Air Base in Germany, the kind of day where the autumn wind carried the scent of jet fuel and distant thunder from training exercises. Sarah sat in the pilot's lounge, her flight suit unzipped to her waist, combat boots propped up on the coffee table, completely absorbed in Sun Tzu's ancient wisdom about warfare and strategy. At 32, Captain Mitchell had earned her callsign Ghost, not just for her uncanny ability to appear and disappear from enemy radar, but for her almost supernatural calm under pressure. With over 3,000 flight hours and everything from F-16 Fighting Falcons to the massive C-130 Hercules transport aircraft, she was considered one of the most versatile pilots in the United States Air Force. Her colleagues respected her not just for her technical skills, but for her ability to think 3 steps ahead of any situation, a trait that had saved countless lives during her 4 combat deployments across the Middle East and Eastern Europe. The afternoon sun streamed through the lounge windows, casting long shadows across the worn leather chairs and military magazines scattered on side tables. Sarah had been looking forward to this rare moment of peace. Her squadron had just completed a grueling month of joint NATO exercises, and for the first time in weeks, she wasn't scheduled for any flights, briefings, or emergency standby duty. She had planned to spend the entire afternoon lost in her book, maybe grab dinner at the base mess hall, and get a full 8 hours of sleep, a luxury that seemed increasingly rare in her line of work. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The base's public address system crackled to life with the familiar electronic hum that preceded all announcements. Sarah didn't even look up from her book initially. Routine announcements about mess hall schedules, weather updates, and maintenance advisories were constant background noise in military life. But something in the tone of the voice that followed made her pause mid-sentence. All available pilots to the operations center immediately. Priority Alpha emergency. Repeat. All available pilots to the operations center immediately. This is not a drill. Priority Alpha. Sarah's blood ran cold. In her 12 years of military service, she had heard that designation only 3 times, and each time it had meant that lives were hanging in the balance somewhere in the world. She slammed her book shut, her peaceful afternoon evaporating like morning mist. Within seconds, she was on her feet, zipping up her flight suit and grabbing her helmet bag from the nearby locker. The base's operations center buzzed with controlled chaos when Sarah arrived. Dozens of pilots from various squadrons filled the briefing room, their conversations a mixture of speculation and nervous energy. At the front of the room, Colonel James Hammer Rodriguez stood before a massive digital display showing a map of the North Atlantic Ocean. Red emergency markers blinked ominously across the screen, and Sarah could see weather data indicating severe storm conditions across a vast area of ocean. "Listen up, people," Colonel Rodriguez's voice cut through the chatter like a blade. 47 minutes ago, we received a Mayday call from civilian aircraft November 747 Charlie, a private Cessna Citation carrying 6 passengers, including 2 children, en route from Reykjavik to London. The aircraft experienced catastrophic engine failure and is currently ditching in the North Atlantic, approximately 400 nautical miles southwest of Ireland. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. North Atlantic in October? Water temperatures that would kill within minutes, waves that could reach 30 feet, and weather conditions that made search and rescue operations nearly impossible? She had flown rescue missions before, but this was different. The distance from the nearest land, the severity of the weather, and the time constraints created a perfect storm of deadly variables. "This is where it gets interesting," the colonel continued, his expression grim. "We've been specifically requested by NATO Joint Operations to provide assistance. However, this mission is strictly volunteer only. The weather conditions exceed normal operational parameters, and frankly, the odds of success are marginal at best." Sarah studied the tactical display more carefully. The crash site was positioned in one of the most unforgiving stretches of ocean in the world, an area known to mariners as the graveyard of the Atlantic, for good reason. Hundreds of ships had been lost in these waters over the centuries, claimed by storms that could appear with little warning and waves that could dwarf buildings. As Colonel Rodriguez continued his briefing, Sarah found herself calculating flight times, fuel consumption rates, and weather windows in her head. The numbers weren't encouraging. Even with the Air Force's most capable long-range aircraft, they would be operating at the very edge of their operational envelope. The KC-135 Stratotanker could provide aerial refueling, but coordinating a refueling operation in these weather conditions would be extremely dangerous for both aircraft involved. The aircraft we're dealing with is equipped with standard emergency equipment, life vests, emergency beacon, and a 6-person life raft rated for North Atlantic conditions, Rodriguez explained. Last radio contact indicated they were following proper ditching procedures and had deployed the raft successfully. However, that was over an hour ago, and we haven't had any communication since. Sarah raised her hand. Sir, what assets do we have available for this mission? Good question, Captain Mitchell. We have several options, but none of them are ideal. Rodriguez clicked to another slide showing aircraft specifications. The HC-130J Combat King II has the range and the rescue capabilities, but the weather conditions are beyond its operational limits. The CV-22 Osprey has the vertical lift capability we need, but lacks the range without multiple refueling operations. The complexity of the mission was becoming clear. This wasn't just about flying to a location and picking up survivors. This was about coordinating multiple aircraft, managing fuel consumption across vast distances, and executing precision operations in weather conditions that would challenge even the most experienced pilots. There is one option, Rodriguez continued, his tone becoming more serious. We could attempt a mission using the HH-60G Pavehawk with extended-range fuel tanks, supported by HC-130 refueling operations. It would require flying in weather conditions that are technically beyond normal operating parameters, but it's theoretically possible. Major Lisa Chen, one of the squadron's most experienced helicopter pilots, spoke up from the back of the room. Sir, with respect, the Pavehawk's combat radius is only about 300 nautical miles. Even with extended tanks and perfect conditions, we'd be cutting it extremely close. You're absolutely right, Major Chen, which is why this mission would require not just exceptional flying skills, but perfect coordination between multiple aircraft and ground support teams. Rodriguez paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. The rescue helicopter would need to rendezvous with HC-130 tankers at least twice during the mission, once on the way to the target area and once on the return journey. Any miscalculation, any equipment failure, any deviation from the flight plan could result in losing not just the original crash victims, but the rescue crew as well. Sarah studied the faces of her fellow pilots around the room. She could see the same mixture of determination and apprehension that she felt herself. Every person in this room had signed up to risk their lives to save others. But this mission was asking them to operate beyond the normal bounds of calculated risk. The weather window is critical, Rodriguez continued. Current meteorological data suggests we have approximately 4 hours before conditions deteriorate to the point where the mission becomes impossible. After that, wind speeds will exceed 50 knots, wave heights will surpass 30 feet, and visibility will drop to near zero. The colonel clicked to a detailed timeline showing the mission parameters. Launch time would be in 90 minutes. Transit time to the target area is 2 hours and 15 minutes, including one aerial refueling operation. On-scene time for the rescue operation cannot exceed 30 minutes, given fuel constraints, and deteriorating weather. Return transit time is 2 hours and 30 minutes, accounting for headwinds and one additional refueling operation. Sarah did the math quickly in her head. Total mission time of nearly 6 hours, with critical refueling operations that had to be executed perfectly in increasingly difficult weather conditions. The margin for error was essentially zero. I want to be absolutely clear about the risks involved. Rodriguez's voice took on a more personal tone. The Irish Coast Guard helicopter attempted to reach the crash site 40 minutes ago and had to turn back due to severe turbulence and icing conditions. His pilot described the weather as the worst he'd encountered in 15 years of rescue operations. The room remained silent as everyone processed this information. If experienced Coast Guard pilots who specialized in North Atlantic rescue operations couldn't handle the conditions, what made them think they could succeed? However, we do have some advantages, Rodriguez continued. Our aircraft are equipped with more advanced weather radar, de-icing systems, and navigation equipment. More importantly, we have pilots with combat experience who are trained to operate in conditions that would ground civilian aircraft. Sarah felt a familiar sensation, the same mixture of fear and excitement that she had experienced before every combat mission. This wasn't combat in the traditional sense, but it carried the same life-and-death stakes, the same requirement for split-second decision-making, and the same potential for both triumph and tragedy. The mission profile would involve a 4-aircraft formation, Rodriguez explained, clicking to a tactical display. 1 HH-60G Pavehawk rescue helicopter,
two HC-130J Combat King II aircraft for aerial refueling and coordination, and one MC-130H Combat Talon II aircraft for communication relay and weather reconnaissance. The complexity was staggering. Coordinating 4 aircraft across hundreds of miles of ocean in deteriorating weather conditions while executing precision refueling operations and conducting a rescue in 30-foot swells. Sarah had participated in complex military operations before, but nothing quite like this. Each aircraft would have specific roles and responsibilities, Rodriguez explained, clicking to a tactical display. The rescue helicopter would obviously conduct the actual pickup operation. The HC-130s would provide fuel and service communication platforms. The MC-130 would conduct advanced weather reconnaissance and coordinate with civilian authorities. Major Chen raised another question. Sir, what kind of rescue equipment are we talking about? Standard rescue swimmer operations aren't going to work in these conditions. Excellent point, Major. The rescue would have to be conducted using the helicopter's host system exclusively. We cannot put rescue swimmers in the water in these conditions. The survival time would be measured in minutes, not hours. Everything depends on the helicopter crew's ability to locate the survivors, position the aircraft precisely, and execute a perfect hoist operation while dealing with severe turbulence and wind conditions. Sarah began to understand why every pilot in the room was being given this briefing. This mission would require not just one exceptional pilot, but an entire team of exceptional aircrew members, each performing at the absolute peak of their abilities. The rescue helicopter pilot would need to demonstrate precision flying skills that bordered on the supernatural, while the HC-130 pilots would need to execute aerial refueling operations in conditions that would challenge even the most experienced tanker crews.
Before we continue, I want each of you to understand something, Colonel Rodriguez said, his expression becoming even more grave. This is not just about following orders or completing a mission. 6 people are floating in a life raft in the North Atlantic Ocean right now, and their survival depends on decisions we make in this room today. Among those 6 people are 2 children, ages 7 and 9, traveling with their family. The mention of children changed the atmosphere in the room immediately. Sarah could feel the shift in energy, the way every pilot straightened slightly in their chair. In military aviation, there were missions you flew because you were ordered to, missions you flew because they served strategic objectives, and missions you flew because they were simply the right thing to do. This was clearly the latter. The father is Dr. Michael Harrison, a cardiac surgeon who was returning from a medical conference in Reykjavik. The mother is Elena Harrison, a teacher at an international school in London. The children are Emma, 7 years old, and James, 9 years old. Rodriguez paused, letting the human element of the mission sink in. Also on board are Dr. Harrison's colleague, Dr. Sarah White, and the pilot, Captain Tommy McLeod, a retired RAF pilot with over 8,000 flight hours. Sarah found herself thinking about those children, trying to imagine what they must be experiencing right now, floating in a life raft in the middle of the North Atlantic Ocean, watching 30-foot waves crash around them, feeling the bitter cold seeping through their emergency gear. Children that age wouldn't fully understand the danger they were in, but they would certainly feel the fear of the adults around them. Current intelligence suggests the life raft deployed successfully and is equipped with emergency supplies for up to 10 days under normal conditions. However, given the weather conditions and water temperatures, those supplies become irrelevant if we can't reach them within the next few hours. Rodriguez clicked to another slide showing survival statistics. The numbers were stark and unforgiving. In water temperatures below 40 degrees Fahrenheit, even with proper survival gear, exposure would begin to take its toll within hours. Hypothermia would set in gradually, starting with loss of fine motor control and progressing to confusion, disorientation, and eventually unconsciousness. The emergency beacon is transmitting normally, which gives us an exact location. However, weather conditions are affecting signal strength, and we may lose that beacon if the life raft's electronics are damaged by salt water or impact damage. Sarah studied the technical specifications displayed on screen. The HH-60G Pavehawk was an incredibly capable aircraft,
but it was being asked to perform at the very limits of its design parameters. Maximum range with extended fuel tanks was approximately 600 nautical miles, but that assumed optimal conditions and no loitering time over the target area. In the current weather conditions, fuel consumption would increase significantly due to the energy required to fight headwinds and maintain stable flight in turbulence. The aerial refueling operations present their own challenges, Rodriguez continued. Standard procedure calls for refueling operations to be conducted at altitudes above 10,000 feet in stable air conditions. Current weather reports indicate severe turbulence and icing conditions above 8,000 feet throughout the target area. This meant that the refueling operations would have to be conducted at lower altitudes in rougher air with reduced visibility. Sarah had participated in hundreds of aerial refueling operations during her career, but always under controlled conditions with multiple backup options available. This mission would require executing those same precision maneuvers while dealing with conditions that push both aircraft and crew to their absolute limits. I need to stress that this mission is entirely voluntary, Rodriguez emphasized again. The risks are substantial, and frankly, the probability of success is marginal at best. Major Chen spoke up again. Sir, what's the timeline for decision-making? How long do we have to organize crews and launch aircraft? Based on current weather projections, we have a window of approximately 4.5 hours before conditions become completely impossible. That gives us 90 minutes to finalize crews, conduct mission planning, and launch aircraft. After that, we're looking at waiting 12 to 18 hours for the next possible weather window. The implication was clear. Waiting 12 to 18 hours wasn't really an option. By then, the survivors would almost certainly have succumbed to exposure, hypothermia, or drowning. This was their only realistic chance. Sarah found herself thinking back to her book, to Sun Tzu's Principles of Warfare and Strategy. One passage came back to her particularly clearly. In the midst of chaos, there is also opportunity. The current situation was certainly chaotic: severe weather, marginal aircraft performance, extreme time constraints, and lives hanging in the balance. But within that chaos, there was also an opportunity to save 6 lives, including 2 children who deserve the chance to grow up and live full lives. I want to volunteer for the mission, Sarah said, her voice cutting through the quiet murmur of conversation that had begun among the pilots. Rodriguez nodded acknowledgement. Thank you, Captain Mitchell. However, I should clarify that we're looking for a complete flight crew, not just individual volunteers. The rescue helicopter requires a pilot, co-pilot, flight engineer, and 2 rescue specialists. The HC-130s each require complete crews as well. The complexity continued to compound. This wasn't just about finding one exceptional pilot willing to take extraordinary risks. It was about assembling multiple complete flight crews, each member of which would need to perform flawlessly under conditions that would challenge the most experienced military aviators. Major Chen, Captain Rodriguez, Lieutenant Colonel Barnes, I'd like to speak with each of you privately after this briefing, Rodriguez announced. Captain Mitchell, Major Thompson, Captain Lee, same for you. We need to assemble crews based on experience, skill sets, and honestly, psychological profiles that suggest you can handle this level of stress and risk. Sarah understood. This mission would require not just technical flying skills, but mental toughness that went beyond normal military training. The pilots would need to remain calm and focused while dealing with life-or-death decisions, equipment operating at its limits, and weather conditions that could kill them as easily as the people they're trying to save. The briefing continued for another 30 minutes, covering technical details about fuel consumption, communication protocols, emergency procedures, and coordination with civilian authorities. But Sarah found her mind drifting back to those 2 children floating somewhere in the North Atlantic. In her imagination, she could see them huddled together in the life raft, trying to stay warm, trying to be brave while the adults around them worked to keep everyone alive. As the briefing concluded and pilots began filing out of the operations center, Sarah remained in her seat for a moment, staring at the tactical displays showing the crash site. The red emergency marker blinked steadily, a small electronic heartbeat representing 6 human lives depending on the decisions made by people they would never meet. She thought about the book she had been reading, about ancient strategies for winning impossible battles. Sun Tzu had written about the importance of choosing your battles carefully, but also about the necessity of taking decisive action when the stakes were high enough. This was clearly one of those moments when decisive action was required, regardless of the risks.
20 minutes later, Sarah found herself in Colonel Rodriguez's private office, along with 3 other pilots who had volunteered for the mission. The office walls were covered with photographs from Rodriguez's 25-year career, images of aircraft, fellow pilots, and mission patches that told the story of decades spent in military aviation. But today, those images seemed to fade into the background, as Rodriguez focused intently on the 4 people who might be the only hope for 6 strangers floating in the North Atlantic. "I'm going to be direct with each of you," Rodriguez began, settling behind his desk. "This mission has a higher probability of failure than success. The weather conditions alone would normally ground our aircraft. The distances involved push our equipment beyond normal operational limits, and the time constraints mean we have essentially one chance to get everything right." Major Lisa Chen sat forward in her chair. "Sir, with respect, you wouldn't have called us here if you thought the mission was impossible. What do you know that you haven't told us yet?" Rodriguez smiled slightly, the first time Sarah had seen any lightness in his expression since the briefing began. "You're right, Major. There are a few factors that might tip the odds in our favor." He turned to his computer and brought up a detailed meteorological analysis. "Our weather reconnaissance team has identified a narrow corridor of relatively stable air that extends from our current position to approximately 50 miles north of the crash site." Sarah studied the weather data carefully. The stable air corridor was still showing wind speeds of 30 to 35 knots and moderate turbulence, but compared to the severe conditions surrounding it, it represented a navigable path through the storm system. "The corridor is narrow, only about 20 miles wide, and it's moving. We'd need to time our departure precisely to stay within it for the majority of the outbound flight. More importantly, we'd need to complete the rescue operation and begin our return journey before the corridor shifts away from the crash site." Major Lisa Chen sat forward in her chair. "Sir, with respect, you wouldn't have called us here if you thought the mission was impossible. What do you know that you haven't told us yet?" Rodriguez smiled slightly, the first time Sarah had seen any lightness in his expression since the briefing began. "You're right, Major. There are a few factors that might tip the odds in our favor." He turned to his computer and brought up a detailed meteorological analysis. "Our weather reconnaissance team has identified a narrow corridor of relatively stable air that extends from our current position to approximately 50 miles north of the crash site." Sarah studied the weather data carefully. The stable air corridor was still showing wind speeds of 30 to 35 knots and moderate turbulence, but compared to the severe conditions surrounding it, it represented a navigable path through the storm system. "The corridor is narrow, only about 20 miles wide, and it's moving. We'd need to time our departure precisely to stay within it for the majority of the outbound flight. More importantly, we'd need to complete the rescue operation and begin our return journey before the corridor shifts away from the crash site." Major Mike Thompson, one of the HC-130 pilots, leaned back in his chair. "How long do we have before the corridor moves away from the target area?" "Current projections suggest approximately 5 hours from right now. That gives us enough time to launch, conduct the rescue, and make it most of the way back before conditions become completely impossible." Sarah felt a spark of cautious optimism. The mission was still incredibly dangerous, but the weather corridor provided a thread of possibility that hadn't existed during the initial briefing. "Sir, what about the aerial refueling operations? Can we conduct them within this corridor?" "That's where it gets interesting, Captain Mitchell. The corridor actually provides better conditions for refueling than we initially expected. Wind speeds are more consistent, turbulence is reduced, and visibility should be adequate for visual contact between aircraft." Lieutenant Colonel James Brick Barnes, the most senior pilot in the room, spoke up. "Sir, I've been running some calculations based on the fuel consumption data you provided.
Even with perfect conditions and successful refueling operations, we're going to be operating with extremely tight fuel margins. Any delays, any weather-related detours, any equipment malfunctions, and we risk running out of fuel before reaching a suitable landing site. Rodriguez nodded grimly. You're absolutely right, Colonel Barnes, which is why we're also positioning emergency landing sites along the return route. The Royal Air Force has agreed to have their bases in Scotland and Northern Ireland on standby for emergency landings. Additionally, we're coordinating with civilian airports in Ireland to serve as backup options if needed. The conversation continued for another hour, diving deep into the technical aspects of the mission. They discussed fuel consumption rates in various weather conditions, backup communication protocols if primary systems failed, and emergency procedures for everything from equipment malfunctions to crew injuries. Sarah found herself impressed by the level of detail that had gone into the planning, but also sobered by the number of things that could go wrong. I want each of you to think carefully about this decision, Rodriguez concluded. You have 15 minutes to decide whether you are committed to this mission. If any of you have doubts about your own capabilities, about the aircraft, about the weather conditions, about anything, now is the time to speak up. Once we begin mission preparations, there's no turning back. As Sarah walked back toward the pilot's lounge, her mind raced through everything she had learned in the past 2 hours. The mission was dangerous, possibly suicidal, but it was also the kind of operation that defined what it meant to serve in the military. 6 people were depending on decisions made by people they had never met, trusting that someone, somewhere, would be willing to risk everything to save them. She thought about her own background, about the training and experiences that had prepared her for exactly this type of situation. Growing up in rural Montana, she had learned to fly in conditions that would terrify most pilots. Mountain flying in unpredictable weather, landing on short strips with significant crosswinds, and dealing with mechanical emergencies far from any help. Her military training had built on that foundation, teaching her to remain calm under pressure and make life-and-death decisions with incomplete information. More importantly, she thought about the oath that she had taken when she was commissioned as an officer in the United States Air Force. The words came back to her clearly. I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. I will well and faithfully discharge the duties of the office upon which I am about to enter. Today, those duties meant risking her life to save 6 strangers floating in the North Atlantic Ocean. Sarah made her decision before she reached the lounge. She turned around and walked back to Colonel Rodriguez's office, where she found him staring at weather data on his computer screen. Sir, I'm committed to the mission, she announced. What do you need me to do? Rodriguez looked up from his computer and studied her face carefully. Captain Mitchell, I want you to understand that you'll be the primary pilot for the rescue helicopter. Everything depends on your ability to locate the survivors, position the aircraft precisely in 30-foot swells, and execute a perfect hoist operation while dealing with severe weather conditions. As Sarah met his gaze steadily, Sir, I've been preparing for this mission my entire career. I'm ready. Good. Major Chen has also committed to serving as your co-pilot. Lieutenant Colonel Barnes will fly the primary C-130 tanker, and Captain Thompson will pilot the backup tanker. We have complete crews for all aircraft, and we're beginning mission preparations immediately. Rodriguez stood up and moved to the window overlooking the flight line. Sarah could see maintenance crews already beginning to prepare aircraft, loading equipment and conducting pre-flight inspections under the gray October sky. Captain Mitchell, I want you to know that in 25 years of military service, I've never asked pilots to undertake a mission with this level of risk. But I also can't think of anyone better qualified to lead this rescue operation. The next hour passed in a blur of intense preparation. Sarah and her crew conducted detailed briefings on rescue procedures, studied weather updates, reviewed communication protocols, and performed extensive equipment checks on their HH-60G Pavehawk. The helicopter had been configured with extended-range fuel tanks, advanced navigation equipment, and specialized rescue gear designed for operations in extreme conditions. Technical Sergeant Maria Rodriguez, the flight engineer, walked Sarah through every system on the aircraft. Ma'am, I've been working on Pavehawks for 8 years, and I've never seen one configured quite like this. We've got fuel capacity that'll give us approximately 6 hours of flight time under optimal conditions, But in these weather conditions, we're looking at maybe 4.5 hours maximum. The margins were still incredibly tight, but Sarah felt confident in her crew and their equipment. Master Sergeant John Tank Williams and Staff Sergeant Lisa Park, the rescue specialists, had configured the helicopter's hoist system for operations in severe sea conditions. They had practiced the rescue procedures dozens of times, but never in weather conditions like they would face today.
As the mission launch time approached, Sarah found herself experiencing the familiar pre-flight ritual that had become second nature over her years in military aviation. She conducted her personal equipment check, helmet, survival gear, emergency procedures checklist, with the methodical precision that could mean the difference between life and death in an emergency situation. But today, that routine carried additional weight. This wasn't a training exercise or even a standard combat mission. This was a rescue operation where 6 lives depended on everything going exactly according to plan. The weather briefing at T-minus 30 minutes painted a sobering picture. The storm system had continued to intensify, with wind speeds now reaching 45 knots across much of the target area. The narrow corridor of relatively stable air that had given them hope was still present, but it was moving faster than initially projected. This meant they would have less time over the target area and would need to execute the rescue operation with even greater precision. Current wave heights at the crash site are 28 to 32 feet, announced Captain Rebecca Storm Martinez, the squadron's meteorologist. That's just within the operational limits for rescue operations, but barely. Any increase beyond 35 feet and we'll have to abort the mission for safety reasons. Sarah absorbed this information while continuing her pre-flight preparations. 30-foot waves meant that the life raft would be rising and falling through a vertical distance of 60 feet or more as it rode the swells. Positioning a helicopter precisely enough to conduct a rescue operation in those conditions would require flying skills that bordered on the superhuman. Major Chen joined Sarah at their helicopter for the final equipment check. "I've been thinking about the hoist operations," she said, her voice betraying the tension they all felt. "In these wave conditions, we're going to have maybe a 30-second window to get each person from the raft to the helicopter. Miss that window, and we'll have to wait for the next wave cycle." "How many people can we lift in each hoist operation?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Given the weight limitations and the need for rescue specialists to assist with each person, we're looking at 1 person per hoist operation, maybe 2 if we're dealing with the children together, but that's risky in these conditions. Sarah did the math quickly. 6 people, 6 separate hoist operations, each requiring precise positioning and timing, in 30-foot waves with limited fuel and a weather window that was closing rapidly. The complexity was staggering, but she had trained for complex operations her entire career. Technical Sergeant Rodriguez approached with the final fuel load report. "Ma'am, we're loaded to maximum capacity. Total fuel load gives us approximately 4 hours and 45 minutes of flight time under current weather conditions. Transit time to the target area is 2 hours and 20 minutes, including 1 refueling operation. That gives us approximately 35 minutes on station for the rescue operation. 35 minutes to locate 6 people in 30-foot waves, position the helicopter 6 separate times for hoist operations, and extract all survivors before fuel constraints forced them to depart." Sarah had participated in rescue operations before, but none with such tight time constraints and unforgiving conditions. The final briefing brought together all 4 aircraft crews in the operations center. Colonel Rodriguez stood before the tactical display, showing real-time weather updates and the projected flight path through the stable air corridor. "Gentlemen and ladies, this is it. Current intelligence indicates that the life raft is still transmitting its emergency beacon, which means at least some of the survivors are still alive, and the raft's electronics are functioning." Sarah studied the beacon data displayed on screen. The signal was strong and consistent, which was encouraging. However, she also noticed that the beacon's position had drifted approximately 12 miles since the initial crash site was established. This meant the life raft was moving with the ocean currents, adding another variable to an already complex rescue operation. "The drift pattern is consistent with current ocean conditions in that area," Rodriguez continued. "We've updated the target coordinates accordingly. but be prepared for the raft to continue drifting throughout the rescue operation. Your navigation systems have been programmed with predicted drift patterns, but visual contact will be essential for the final approach. Lieutenant Colonel Barnes raised a concern about the aerial refueling operations. Sir, the refueling points we established during planning are now right at the edge of the stable air corridor. If the corridor shifts during our transit time, we could find ourselves attempting to refuel in severe turbulence conditions. That's a valid concern, Colonel Barnes. We're monitoring the corridor's movement in real time, and we'll update refueling coordinates as needed. However, I want everyone to understand that if the corridor shifts significantly, we may need to abort the mission rather than risk losing aircraft and crews. Sarah appreciated Rodriguez's honesty about the risks, but she also knew that aborting the mission would mean certain death for the 6 people floating in the North Atlantic. The water temperature and weather conditions would kill them long before another rescue attempt could be organized. Final equipment checks are complete, Rodriguez announced. All aircraft are fueled and ready. Weather conditions at departure are within acceptable limits. The stable air corridor extends from our current position to within 50 miles of the target area. He paused, looking around the room at the faces of the crews who would be risking their lives in the next few hours. I want each of you to know that what you're attempting today goes beyond the normal call of duty. You're risking your lives for people you've never met, in conditions that would ground most aircraft because it's the right thing to do. Sarah felt a surge of pride in her fellow aircrew members. Looking around the room, she saw the faces of people who had dedicated their lives to serving others, who were willing to risk everything to save 6 strangers floating in the ocean. This was why she had joined the military, why she had pushed herself through years of demanding training, and why she had chosen a career that required her to make life or death decisions on a regular basis. Aircraft commanders, you have final authority over your individual aircraft and crews. If conditions exceed safe operating parameters at any point during the mission, you are authorized and expected to make the decision to abort. No one will question that decision, and no lives are worth risking unnecessarily. The final briefing concluded, and the crews dispersed to their aircraft for final preparations. Sarah walked toward her HH-60G Pave Hawk, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. In less than 30 minutes, she would be lifting off into weather conditions that challenged the very limits of what was possible with current aviation technology. She would be flying over hundreds of miles of ocean to reach people she had never met, people whose lives depended entirely on her skills as a pilot and the courage of her crew. As she approached her helicopter, she could see the maintenance crew conducting final inspections. Chief Master Sergeant David Park, the senior maintenance supervisor, walked over to meet her. "Ma'am, she's ready to go. We've checked every system twice, loaded every piece of emergency equipment we could fit, and configured her for maximum range and rescue capability. She's never been in better condition." Sarah smiled, appreciating the dedication of the maintenance crews who worked around the clock to keep military aircraft operational. "Thanks, Chief. Take care of things while we're gone." "Bring everyone home safe, Captain. We'll be monitoring your progress from here." Sarah climbed into the pilot's seat of her helicopter and began the systematic pre-flight checklist that would ensure every system was functioning properly. The familiar routine of checking instruments, testing communication equipment, and verifying flight controls helped calm her nerves and focus her mind on the task ahead.
The engines of the HH-60G Pave Hawk came to life with their characteristic whine, building to the steady roar that Sarah had heard thousands of times before. But today, that sound carried special significance. These engines would need to run flawlessly for the next 5 hours, carrying her and her crew across hundreds of miles of hostile ocean to reach 6 people whose lives hung in the balance. Ramstein Tower, Rescue 7-1 requesting clearance for departure. Sarah spoke into her headset microphone, her voice calm and professional despite the extraordinary nature of the mission they were beginning. Rescue 7-1, you are cleared for departure. Winds are 270 at 32 knots, gusting to 38. Be advised, weather conditions are deteriorating rapidly to the west. Safe flight and bring everyone home. Sarah appreciated the tower controller's personal touch. In military aviation, controllers usually maintained strict professionalism, but today's mission had captured the attention of everyone on the base. People who would normally be focused on routine operations were instead tracking the progress of a rescue mission that represented the very best of what military aviation could accomplish. Roger Ramstein Tower, Rescue 7-1 departing. The helicopter lifted off smoothly despite the gusty wind conditions. Sarah felt the familiar sensation of transitioning from the solid stability of ground contact to the dynamic environment of flight. But today, instead of the usual sense of freedom that came with takeoff, she felt the weight of responsibility for the lives that depended on the success of this mission. As they climbed through 2,000 feet, Sarah could see the other aircraft in their formation taking their positions. Lieutenant Colonel Barnes' HC-130 tanker was visible off their right wing, its 4 turboprop engines leaving thin contrails in the cold October air. Captain Thompson's backup tanker was positioned several miles behind them, ready to provide additional fuel if needed. The MC-130 communication relay aircraft was already en route to the target area, establishing contact with civilian authorities and providing real-time weather updates. Rescue 7-1, this is Tanker 2-1. We have you in sight and are ready to begin formation flight. Barnes's voice came through the radio. Roger, Tanker 2-1, Rescue 7-1 is ready to proceed. The formation flew west toward the Atlantic Ocean, following the narrow corridor of stable air that represented their best hope of reaching the crash site safely. Sarah monitored weather radar continuously, watching for any signs that the corridor was shifting or deteriorating. So far, conditions were holding within acceptable limits, but she could see the massive storm system that surrounded their narrow path of relatively calm air. Major Chen handled navigation duties, continuously updating their position and calculating fuel consumption rates. We're making good time, she reported. Current ground speed is 180 knots, which puts us approximately 15 minutes ahead of schedule. Fuel consumption is slightly higher than planned due to headwinds, but still within acceptable parameters. The first hour of flight passed smoothly, with the formation maintaining position within the stable air corridor. Sarah found herself settling into the rhythm of long-distance flying, monitoring instruments, adjusting course for wind drift, communicating with other aircraft in the formation. But she never lost sight of the ultimate purpose of their mission. Somewhere ahead of them, 6 people were floating in a life raft, fighting to survive in conditions that could kill them at any moment. Rescue 7-1, this is Control 1. We have established contact with the survivors. Life raft is intact. All 6 persons are alive, but they're reporting severe cold and one possible case of hypothermia. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and urgency. The survivors were still alive, which meant the mission still had purpose, but the report of hypothermia meant that time was running out. In North Atlantic water temperatures, hypothermia could progress rapidly from mild symptoms to life-threatening conditions. Control 1, this is Rescue 7-1. What's the status of the children? Rescue 7-1, both children are conscious and responsive, but they're showing early signs of cold exposure. The adults are rotating positions to keep the children in the center of the raft, sharing body heat and protective gear. Sarah could picture the scene, adults sacrificing their own comfort and safety to protect 2 children, doing everything possible to keep them alive until help could arrive. The image strengthened her resolve to succeed in this mission, regardless of the risks involved. As they approached the first aerial refueling point, Sarah could see the challenges they would face. The supposedly stable air corridor was still producing significant turbulence, with the helicopter being buffeted by wind gusts that made precise flying extremely difficult. Aerial refueling required the helicopter to maintain exact position relative to the tanker aircraft while a fuel hose was connected, a procedure that demanded absolute precision under the best of conditions. Tanker 2-1, this is Rescue 7-1, ready to begin refueling procedures, Sarah announced, her voice steady despite the increasing difficult flying conditions. Tanker 2-1, this is Rescue 7-1, ready to begin refueling procedures. Rescue 7-1, Tanker 2-1 is ready to proceed. Be advised, we're experiencing moderate to severe turbulence at this altitude. Recommend we conduct refueling at 8,000 feet to minimize wind effects. Sarah descended to the refueling altitude, fighting increasing turbulence as the helicopter dropped into the more unstable air closer to the ocean's surface. The HC-130 tanker deployed its refueling drogue, a cone-shaped basket at the end of a long hose that the helicopter had to connect with using a probe mounted on its fuselage. "Beginning approach for contact," Sarah announced, maneuvering the helicopter toward the tanker's drogue. The procedure required her to fly the helicopter close enough to the tanker that their wingtips were separated by only a few dozen feet, then maintain that position while turbulence tried to throw both aircraft around the sky. The first approach was unsuccessful. A sudden wind gust pushed the helicopter away from the drogue just as Sarah was about to make contact. "Breaking away, trying again," she announced, pulling the helicopter back to a safe distance before beginning another approach. The second approach was successful, with the helicopter's refueling probe sliding smoothly into the tanker's drogue. "Contact," Sarah announced with satisfaction. "Beginning fuel transfer." For the next 20 minutes, Sarah had to maintain precise position relative to the tanker while fuel flowed from the HC-130 into the helicopter's tanks. This was always a challenging procedure, but in current weather conditions, it required constant attention and minute adjustments to keep the two aircraft properly aligned. "Fuel transfer complete," announced Technical Sergeant Rodriguez from the flight engineer's position. "We're back to maximum fuel load." "Roger, breaking contact," Sarah replied, carefully backing the helicopter away from the tanker's drogue. As soon as they were clear, she felt a sense of accomplishment. They had successfully completed the first critical phase of the mission, proving that aerial refueling was possible even in these difficult conditions. Rescue 7-1, this is Control 1. Updated weather report from the target area. Wind speeds have increased to 42 knots. Wave heights are now 30 to 35 feet. We are right at the edge of safe operating parameters for rescue operations. Sarah absorbed this information while continuing to fly toward the crash site. The weather was continuing to deteriorate, which meant they would have even less time over the target area and would need to execute the rescue operation with perfect precision. There would be no room for errors, no second chances if something went wrong. As they flew deeper into the Atlantic Ocean, Sarah could see the conditions becoming progressively worse. The ocean below them was a churning mass of white-capped waves, with spray being blown horizontally by the fierce winds. Visibility was decreasing as they flew into areas of low clouds and occasional rain showers. The helicopter was being buffeted constantly by turbulence, requiring continuous control inputs to maintain level flight. "Target area is approximately 40 miles ahead," Major Chen announced, studying the navigation display. "We should have visual contact with the life raft in approximately 15 minutes, assuming weather conditions don't deteriorate further." Sarah began mentally preparing for the most challenging part of the mission, locating the life raft in 30-foot waves and executing multiple rescue operations in conditions that pushed both aircraft and crew to their absolute limits. Everything they had trained for, everything they had prepared for, was about to be put to the ultimate test. The first visual contact with the life raft came exactly when Major Chen had predicted, but the reality of the situation was far more challenging than any training scenario Sarah had ever experienced. Through the helicopter's rain-streaked windscreen, she could see a small orange speck rising and falling dramatically on mountainous waves that seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions. The life raft appeared impossibly tiny against the vast gray expanse of the North Atlantic, a fragile bubble of hope floating in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. "Visual contact with survivors," Sarah announced over the radio, her voice remaining calm despite the daunting scene before them. "Life raft is intact and appears to have all 6 persons on board. Beginning approach for rescue operations." As they drew closer, the true scale of the challenge became apparent. The waves were indeed 30 to 35 feet high, creating valleys and peaks that made the ocean look like a constantly shifting mountain range. The life raft was riding these swells like a cork, rising 60 feet or more from trough to crest, then disappearing completely behind the next wave before rising again moments later. "Jesus," whispered Staff Sergeant Park from her position at the rescue hoist. "I've never seen anything like this. How are we supposed to maintain position when the target is moving through a 60-foot vertical range every 30 seconds? Sarah was asking herself the same question, but she had trained for years to operate in impossible conditions. We're going to time our approaches with the wave cycles. When the raft is at the top of a swell, we'll have approximately 15 seconds to position over it and deploy the rescue hoist before it drops into the next trough. Technical Sergeant Rodriguez was monitoring the helicopter systems carefully. "Ma'am, we're consuming fuel faster than projected due to the constant power adjustments needed to maintain position. Current consumption rate gives us approximately 28 minutes on station before we need to depart for refueling." 28 minutes to rescue 6 people in these conditions. Sarah did the math quickly. Less than 5 minutes per person, including the time needed to reposition the helicopter between each rescue. It was barely enough time, assuming everything went perfectly. Any complications, any delays, any equipment malfunctions, and they would run out of fuel before completing the rescue. "Rescue 7-1, this is Control Warren," came the voice of the MC-130 communication aircraft. "Be advised, weather conditions are continuing to deteriorate. We're seeing wind gusts up to 48 knots, and wave heights may exceed 35 feet within the next hour." Sarah acknowledged the transmission while maneuvering the helicopter into position for the first rescue attempt. She could see the 6 survivors in the life raft now, 2 adults holding small children, and 2 other adults working frantically with the raft's equipment to try to stay afloat in the massive waves. Even from a distance, she could see that they were all suffering from exposure to the cold and salt water. "First rescue will be one of the children," Sarah announced to her crew. "Staff Sergeant Park, you will be going down on the hoist. Master Sergeant Williams will operate the hoist from inside the aircraft. Major Chen will handle navigation and communications while I focus on aircraft positioning." The helicopter's rescue hoist was a marvel of engineering, a powered winch capable of lifting 600 pounds through a distance of 200 feet. Under normal conditions, rescue operations were straightforward. Hover over the target, lower the rescue specialist, attach the survivor to the hoist, and lift them to safety. But nothing about today's conditions was normal. Sarah began her approach to the life raft, timing her movements to coincide with the wave cycles. As the raft rose to the crest of a particularly large swell, she positioned the helicopter directly overhead at an altitude of about 80 feet. For a brief moment, the distance between the aircraft and the survivors was manageable. "Deploying hoist," announced Master Sergeant Williams as the rescue cable began paying out from the helicopter's side door. Staff Sergeant Park descended rapidly toward the life raft, fighting the wind that tried to swing her away from the target. Sarah struggled to maintain position as wind gusts buffeted the helicopter, requiring constant inputs to stay over the moving target. The raft reached the bottom of a wave trough just as Park reached the end of the hoist cable, putting her nearly 40 feet above the survivors. "Wave cycle is wrong," she announced over the radio. "Need to wait for the next peak." Sarah pulled the helicopter back to a safe distance and waited for the raft to ride the next wave to its crest. This was going to be the pattern, timing each rescue attempt to coincide with the brief moments when the raft was at the top of a swell, close enough for the rescue hoist to reach. The second approach was more successful. As the raft rose on the next wave, Park was able to reach the survivors and secure a harness around 7-year-old Emma Harrison. The little girl was semi-conscious from cold exposure, but her father had wrapped her in every piece of protective gear they could spare. "Child is secure on hoist," Park announced. "Beginning lift." Sarah fought to maintain position as the rescue hoist lifted the child from the raft to the helicopter. Wind gusts were now reaching 50 knots, and the helicopter was being thrown around like a toy. Through sheer determination and years of experience, she managed to keep the aircraft stable enough for the rescue operation to continue. "Child is secure in aircraft," announced Williams as Emma was brought inside the helicopter and wrapped in warming blankets. "She's conscious but showing signs of moderate hypothermia. We need to get her to medical care as soon as possible." 1 down, 5 to go. Sarah positioned for the next rescue attempt, knowing that each subsequent operation would be more difficult as weather conditions continued to deteriorate. The fuel gauge showed they had used more than planned during the first rescue. The constant maneuvering in high winds was consuming fuel at an alarming rate. The second rescue was 9-year-old James Harrison. Like his sister, he was suffering from cold exposure but was conscious and alert.
his father had to make the heartbreaking decision of which child to send up first, knowing that the deteriorating weather might prevent completion of the rescue. Second survivor is secure, Park announced after another harrowing rescue sequence. The child is responsive but extremely cold. Both children need immediate medical attention. Sarah began calculating their remaining time on station. They had used nearly 12 minutes for 2 rescues, leaving them approximately 16 minutes for 4 adults. The mathematics were becoming impossible. They were running out of time and fuel simultaneously.
Rescue 7-1, this is Control 1. We're monitoring your fuel status and time on station. You need to be aware that weather conditions are deteriorating faster than predicted. We may need to consider evacuating with the survivors you have and attempting a second rescue mission for the remaining adults. Sarah felt a surge of anger at the suggestion. The idea of leaving 4 people floating in these conditions while she flew to safety was incompatible with everything she believed about military service and human decency. Control 1, negative. We're completing this rescue operation. All 6 survivors are coming home today. Rescue 7-1. Understand your determination, but you need to consider the safety of your crew and the survivors you've already rescued. Don't risk 8 lives trying to save 4. Sarah ignored the transmission and focused on positioning for the 3rd rescue. Dr. Elena Harrison, the children's mother, was next. She had insisted that the children be rescued first, even though she was showing severe signs of hypothermia herself. When Park reached the life raft, Dr. Harrison was barely conscious but still trying to help her husband and the other survivors maintain their grip on the raft's safety lines. The rescue operation took longer than the previous 2. Dr. Harrison was nearly unconscious from cold exposure and couldn't assist with getting into the rescue harness. Park had to secure her manually while fighting wind gusts that threatened to slam her into the life raft or drag her away from the target area entirely. 3rd survivor is secure, Park finally announced after what seemed like hours, but was actually only 6 minutes. Adult female, unconscious, severe hypothermia. She needs immediate warming and medical attention. 3 down, 3 to go. But Sarah could see the fuel gauges approaching critical levels. Technical Sergeant Rodriguez's voice confirmed her fears. "Man, current fuel consumption puts us at minimum fuel for return flight in approximately 8 minutes. We need to begin considering our options." Sarah studied the 3 remaining survivors in the life raft. Dr. Michael Harrison was still conscious and trying to help the other 2 adults maintain their positions in the increasingly violent seas. Dr. Sarah Wright was showing signs of severe hypothermia, but was still responsive. Captain Tommy McLeod, the pilot, appeared to be the most coherent of the remaining survivors, probably due to his experience with emergency situations and his understanding of rescue operations. Staff Sergeant Park, how quickly can we execute the remaining 3 rescues if we modify our procedures? Ma'am, if we can get the survivors to prepare themselves while we're positioning for each rescue, we might be able to cut the time per rescue to 3 minutes each, but that assumes they're conscious and able to assist with the rescue procedures. Sarah made a command decision that would either save all 6 lives or risk losing everyone, including her crew. Control 1, this is Rescue 7-1. We're modifying rescue procedures to complete all 6 rescues within our current fuel limitations. We'll be cutting safety margins extremely close, but it's the only way to save everyone. Rescue 7-1, you are operating beyond safe fuel margins. Strongly recommend you depart with current survivors and return for a second rescue mission. Control 1, negative. By the time we could refuel and return, the remaining survivors would be dead from hypothermia. We're finishing this mission now. Sarah positioned for the 4th rescue, her hands steady on the controls, despite the enormous pressure she felt. Dr. Michael Harrison was next, the father who had just watched his wife and children lifted to safety, but who was now facing the possibility that he might not survive to see them again. The rescue went more smoothly than expected. Dr. Harrison was still conscious and able to assist with the rescue procedures, having watched the previous operations and understanding what was required.
He was lifted to the helicopter in just under 4 minutes, though he was showing severe signs of hypothermia. Fourth survivor secure, Park announced. Adult male, conscious but severe hypothermia. 2 survivors remaining in raft. The fuel situation was now critical. They had enough fuel for the return flight only if they completed the remaining rescues within the next 4 minutes and departed immediately. Sarah could see that the remaining survivors, Dr. Wright and Captain MacLeod, were both struggling to maintain consciousness in the increasingly violent conditions. "Fifth rescue go," Sarah announced, positioning over the life raft for Dr. Wright's rescue. The woman was barely conscious when Park reached her, but MacLeod was able to assist with getting her into the rescue harness. She was lifted to the helicopter in just under 3 minutes, leaving Captain MacLeod alone in the life raft. "Fifth survivor secure," Park announced. 1 survivor remaining. Adult female, unconscious, critical hypothermia. Sarah looked at her fuel gauges and made calculations that bordered on the impossible. They had enough fuel for 1 more rescue and the return flight, but there was no margin for error, no allowance for delays or complications. Everything had to work perfectly from this point forward. Captain MacLeod was the last survivor, floating alone in the life raft that had kept 6 people alive for over 4 hours in conditions that should have killed them all. As Sarah positioned for the final rescue, she could see that MacLeod was still conscious and alert. His aviation experience had probably helped him understand the rescue procedures and manage his exposure to the cold more effectively than the civilian passengers. The final rescue was executed flawlessly. MacLeod was able to assist with the rescue procedures, and he was lifted to the helicopter in just under 3 minutes. As Park and the captain were brought inside the aircraft, Sarah felt a surge of triumph and relief. All 6 survivors were now safely aboard, though several were in critical condition from hypothermia and exposure. "All survivors secure," announced Master Sergeant Williams. "Beginning immediate medical care and warming procedures. Several survivors are in critical condition and need emergency medical treatment as soon as possible." Sarah began the return flight toward their refueling point, knowing that they were now operating with fuel margins that would challenge even the most experienced pilots. The weather conditions had continued to deteriorate during the rescue operation, and the return flight would be conducted in even worse conditions than their outbound journey.
As the helicopter climbed away from the crash site, Sarah could see the empty life raft being tossed by the enormous waves, a small orange remnant of the drama that had just unfolded. In a matter of minutes, that raft would be torn apart by the storm and disappear beneath the surface, taking with it any evidence of the 6 lives that had depended on its integrity for survival. The return flight presented challenges that were arguably more difficult than the rescue operation itself. The helicopter was now carrying the maximum weight load with 6 additional people aboard, which affected its flight characteristics and increased fuel consumption. The weather had deteriorated significantly, with wind speeds now consistently above 50 knots and visibility reduced to less than a mile in driving rain and spray. "Ramstein Control, this is Rescue 7-1, Sarah announced over the radio. "We have all 6 survivors aboard. Multiple survivors are in critical condition from hypothermia and require immediate medical attention upon landing. Request priority routing to nearest medical facility." Rescue 7-1, outstanding work. Medical teams are standing by at Ramstein. Be advised, weather conditions at your refueling point have deteriorated. Tanker 2-1 reports severe turbulence and wind shear. You may need to consider alternate refueling options. Sarah studied her fuel gauges with growing concern. They had enough fuel to reach the planned refueling point, but if they couldn't complete the refueling operation due to weather conditions, they would not have enough fuel to reach any alternate airfield. The mission that had seemed impossible from the beginning was becoming even more challenging as it neared its conclusion. Major Chen was monitoring the survivors' conditions while handling navigation duties. "Captain, Dr. Harrison's wife is unconscious and showing signs of severe hypothermia. The children are stable but need warming. Dr. Wright is also unconscious and may need immediate medical intervention when we land." The weight of responsibility that Sarah felt was enormous.
She had successfully rescued 6 people from certain death, but now their survival depended on her ability to get them to medical care quickly enough to prevent permanent injury or death from hypothermia. The rescue operation had only been the first part of saving their lives. "Rescue 7-1, this is Tanker 2-1, came Lieutenant Colonel Barnes' voice over the radio. "We're holding at the refueling point, but conditions are marginal for refueling operations. Wind speeds are gusting to 55 knots, and we're experiencing severe turbulence. Recommend we attempt refueling at a lower altitude to minimize wind effects." Sarah descended toward the refueling altitude, fighting increasingly violent turbulence that felt strong enough to tear the aircraft apart. Through the rain-streaked windscreen, she could barely make out the C-130 tanker aircraft ahead of them. "Beginning approach for refueling," Sarah announced, though she privately questioned whether the operation would be possible in these conditions. The aerial refueling that had been challenging during their outbound flight now seemed nearly impossible with the deteriorated weather and the helicopter's changed flight characteristics due to the additional weight of 6 survivors. The first approach failed when a severe wind gust pushed the helicopter away from the tanker's refueling drogue. The second approach also failed when turbulence made it impossible to maintain the precise positioning required for fuel transfer. Sarah could feel precious fuel being consumed with each failed approach, fuel that they desperately needed for the return flight to Ramstein. "Tanker 2-1, this is Rescue 7-1. Weather conditions are too severe for safe refueling operations. Request alternate options." "Tanker 2-1, stand by." There was a pause as Barnes consulted with his crew and ground controllers. "Tanker 2-1, we're going to attempt an emergency refueling procedure. We'll descend to 5,000 feet and extend our refueling hose to maximum length. This will put us below the worst turbulence, but it's outside normal safety parameters." Sarah understood the risks. Flying 2 aircraft in close formation at low altitude in severe weather conditions violated multiple safety regulations, but the alternative was running out of fuel over the Atlantic Ocean with 6 hypothermia victims aboard. The choice was clear. "Roger, Tanker 2-1, Rescue 7-1 is ready for emergency refueling procedures." The refueling operation at 5,000 feet was the most challenging flying Sarah had ever attempted. The helicopter and tanker aircraft were both being buffeted by severe turbulence, making formation flying extremely dangerous. The refueling hose was stretched to its maximum length, giving them a larger target, but also making the connection more difficult to maintain. On the third attempt, Sarah managed to guide the helicopter's refueling probe into the tanker's drogue. "Contact," she announced with relief. "Beginning fuel transfer." For the next 15 minutes, Sarah had to maintain precise position relative to the tanker while both aircraft were being thrown around by turbulence that felt strong enough to break them apart. Her hands ached from gripping the flight controls, and sweat poured down her face despite the cold conditions outside. But gradually, fuel flowed from the HC-130 into the helicopter's tanks, giving them the range they needed to reach Ramstein. "Fuel transfer complete," announced Technical Sergeant Rodriguez. "We're back to sufficient fuel load for return flight." "Breaking contact," Sarah replied, carefully backing the helicopter away from the tanker. As soon as they were clear, she felt another surge of accomplishment. They had overcome another seemingly impossible challenge and were now on their way home with all 6 survivors aboard. The final leg of the return flight was a race against time and the deteriorating condition of the survivors. Dr. Harrison's wife had not regained consciousness, and Dr. Wright was also showing signs of critical hypothermia. The 2 children were stable but needed immediate warming and medical attention. "Ramstein Control, this is Rescue 7-1 requesting priority approach for medical emergency. We have multiple critical hypothermia cases aboard requiring immediate medical attention." "Rescue 7-1, you are cleared for priority approach. Medical teams are standing by at the landing pad. Weather conditions at Ramstein are marginal but within limits for helicopter operations." As the lights of Ramstein Air Base appeared through the storm, Sarah felt a mixture of exhaustion and triumph. They had accomplished something that most people would have considered impossible, rescuing 6 people from the North Atlantic Ocean in weather conditions that challenged the very limits of aviation technology.
The landing at Ramstein Air Base was conducted in weather conditions that would normally ground most aircraft, But after what they had just accomplished, landing in 50-knot winds in driving rain seemed almost routine. Sarah brought the helicopter down on the medical pad with the precision that had characterized every aspect of the rescue mission, her hands steady on the controls despite the exhaustion that was beginning to set in. Medical teams were waiting before the helicopter's wheels touched the ground. As soon as the engines began winding down, paramedics and doctors rushed toward the aircraft, ready to provide immediate care for the hypothermia victims. Sarah watched through her side window as the survivors were carefully removed from the helicopter and transferred to waiting ambulances. Dr. Michael Harrison was conscious and able to walk with assistance, though he was clearly suffering from the effects of cold exposure. His first concern was for his family, his wife, who was still unconscious, and his 2 children, who were stable but needed warming. The reunion between father and children on the medical pad was emotional, a reminder of the human element that had driven this entire rescue operation. Dr. Sarah Wright was transferred to an ambulance on a stretcher, still unconscious from severe hypothermia. Captain Tommy McLeod, the pilot whose aircraft had gone down in the North Atlantic, was conscious and alert, though he was also showing signs of cold exposure. As he was helped toward an ambulance, he stopped and turned back towards Sarah's helicopter. "Thank you," he called out over the noise of the wind and rain. "You saved our lives." Sarah nodded acknowledgement from her pilot seat, feeling the weight of what they had accomplished beginning to sink in. 6 people were alive who would certainly have died without the rescue operation. 2 children would grow up to live full lives. A family had been kept together. A skilled pilot would continue flying. A doctor would continue saving lives. As the last ambulance departed for the base hospital, Sarah began the post-flight procedures that would officially conclude the mission. She was exhausted, both physically and emotionally, but she also felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This was why she had joined the military, why she had pushed herself through years of demanding training, why she had chosen a career that required her to risk her life for others. Colonel Rodriguez appeared at the helicopter as Sarah was completing her shutdown checklist. "Captain Mitchell, I want you to know that what you accomplished today goes beyond anything I've seen in 25 years of military service. You and your crew saved 6 lives under conditions that most people would consider impossible." "Thank you, sir, but this was a team effort. Every person involved in this mission, from the maintenance crews who prepared the aircraft to the HC-130 pilots who provided refueling support, contributed to the success." Rodriguez smiled. "That's exactly the kind of leadership that made this mission successful. But don't minimize your own contribution. Your flying skills and decision-making under pressure were extraordinary." As Sarah climbed out of her helicopter, she looked back at the aircraft that had carried them through one of the most challenging missions in modern rescue aviation. The HH-60G Pavehawk showed signs of the brutal conditions they had encountered: salt spray on the windows, minor hail damage on the fuselage, and stress marks that indicated the aircraft had been pushed to its operational limits. Technical Sergeant Rodriguez was already beginning the post-flight inspection. "Ma'am, she performed flawlessly. Every system worked exactly as designed, even under conditions that were beyond normal operational parameters. I've never been more proud of a piece of equipment." Sarah understood the sentiment. Military aircraft were designed to operate in extreme conditions, but today's mission had tested every component, every system, every design specification. The fact that everything had worked perfectly was a testament to the engineers who designed the aircraft, the maintenance crews who kept it operational, and the manufacturing workers who built it with precision and care. The debriefing session that followed was detailed and comprehensive, covering every aspect of the mission from initial planning through final landing. Intelligence officers documented the rescue procedures, meteorologists analyzed the weather conditions, and maintenance personnel recorded the aircraft's performance under extreme stress. "Current status of the survivors?" asked Sarah during the debriefing. "All 6 survivors are stable," reported the base medical officer. "Dr. Elena Harrison and Dr. Sarah Wright are being treated for severe hypothermia, but are expected to make full recoveries. The children are responding well to warming procedures and should be released from the hospital within 48 hours. Dr. Michael Harrison and Captain McLeod are being treated for moderate hypothermia and exposure, but are in good condition." Sarah felt a wave of relief. The rescue operation had been successful not just in getting the survivors to safety, but in getting them to medical care quickly enough to prevent permanent injury or death. The timing had been critical. Another hour in those conditions would almost certainly have been fatal for several of the survivors.
The Irish Coast Guard has asked me to pass along their congratulations, Colonel Rodriguez added. They attempted the same rescue operation and had to turn back due to weather conditions. They said what you accomplished today was beyond the normal bounds of rescue aviation. The formal recognition would come later, commendations, awards, and probably some unwanted media attention. But for Sarah, the real reward was knowing that 6 people were alive who would have died without the mission. The mathematics were simple and undeniable. Her crew had risked their lives to save 6 strangers, and they had succeeded. As the debriefing concluded and Sarah walked toward the crew quarters for some much-needed rest, she thought about the book she had been reading when this adventure began. Sun Tzu's The Art of War contained wisdom about strategy, leadership, and victory under impossible circumstances. Today, she had experienced a different kind of warfare, a battle against nature, against time, against the limitations of technology and human endurance. The victory belonged not just to her, but to everyone who had contributed to the mission's success: the air traffic controllers who had cleared their path, the meteorologists who had identified the weather corridor, the maintenance crews who had prepared the aircraft, the C-130 pilots who provided refueling support, and her own crew members who had performed flawlessly under extraordinary pressure. But most importantly, the victory belonged to 6 people who would wake up tomorrow in a warm hospital instead of floating dead in the North Atlantic Ocean. Dr. Michael Harrison would be reunited with his family, Elena Harrison would recover from her hypothermia and return to teaching, 7-year-old Emma and 9-year-old James Harrison would grow up to live full lives, probably never fully understanding how close they had come to death or how many people had risked their lives to save them. Dr. Sarah Wright would return to her medical practice, and Captain Tommy McLeod would eventually fly again. 6 lives had been saved, and each of those lives would go on to touch countless others. Patients treated, students taught, children raised, contributions made to society that would ripple forward through generations. As Sarah finally reached her quarters and prepared for sleep, she picked up her copy of The Art of War from the table where she had left it hours earlier. The bookmark was still in place, marking the passage about finding opportunity in the midst of chaos. Today, she had found exactly that opportunity and had seized it with both hands. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new missions, new opportunities to serve. But tonight, she would sleep peacefully knowing that somewhere in a military hospital, 6 people were alive who would have died without the courage and skill of people willing to risk everything for strangers they had never met. In the end, that was what military service was really about. Not the aircraft, not the technology, not even the heroic rescues, but the simple human commitment to protect and save lives whenever and wherever possible.
3 weeks later, Captain Sarah Ghost Mitchell found herself in an unusual situation, sitting in the same pilot's lounge where this extraordinary adventure had begun, but this time facing a room full of reporters, military officials, and family members who had gathered for what the Air Force called a recognition ceremony, but what felt more like a celebration of life itself. The ceremony had been planned as a routine military awards presentation, but the story of the North Atlantic rescue had captured international attention. News outlets from around the world had covered the mission, describing it as one of the most daring rescue operations in modern aviation history and a testament to the courage and skill of military aircrew members. Sarah felt uncomfortable with the media attention, but she understood that the story served a larger purpose, highlighting the dedication and professionalism of military personnel who risked their lives to save others. The Harrison family was present at the ceremony, having made the trip from London specifically to thank the rescue crew in person. Dr. Michael Harrison looked healthy and rested, showing no lasting effects from his ordeal in the North Atlantic. His wife Elena had made a complete recovery from her severe hypothermia, though she admitted that she still had nightmares about the cold and the sound of crashing waves. 7-year-old Emma and 9-year-old James were typical energetic children, seemingly unaffected by their brush with death, though their parents had arranged for counseling to help them process the traumatic experience. "Captain Mitchell," Dr. Harrison said during the reception that followed the ceremony, "I want you to understand that you didn't just save our lives that day, you saved our future. Emma wants to be a pilot now because of you. James talks constantly about joining the Air Force when he's old enough. You've given them heroes to look up to and dreams to pursue." Sarah smiled, feeling moved by the doctor's words. "Sir, I was just doing my job. Any pilot in our squadron would have made the same decision and taken the same risks."
Maybe, Elena Harrison interjected, but you were the one who was there when we needed you. You were the one who read the situation correctly, made the right decisions, and brought us home safely. That's not just doing a job, that's being a hero. Dr. Sarah Wright, who had also attended the ceremony, approached Sarah with tears in her eyes. I don't remember much about the rescue itself. I was unconscious for most of it. But I remember being lifted into your helicopter, and I remember feeling safe for the first time since our plane went down. You gave me my life back. Captain Tommy McLeod, the pilot whose aircraft had crashed in the North Atlantic, had a different perspective on the rescue. As a pilot myself, I understand how difficult that mission was. The weather conditions, the fuel constraints, the precision required for those rescue operations. What you accomplished was beyond exceptional flying. It was perfect flying under impossible circumstances. The formal recognition came in the form of the Distinguished Flying Cross, one of the highest awards for aerial achievement in the U.S. Air Force. But Sarah knew that the real recognition came from seeing the 6 survivors healthy and whole, their lives restored and their futures secured. Major Chen, Technical Sergeant Rodriguez, Master Sergeant Williams, and Staff Sergeant Park also received commendations for their roles in the mission, acknowledging that the rescue had been a team effort from beginning to end. Colonel Rodriguez delivered remarks during the ceremony that captured the essence of what had occurred 3 weeks earlier. Military aviation involves routine missions and extraordinary missions. Most of the time, we train for the extraordinary missions, hoping we'll never have to fly them. On October 15th, Captain Mitchell and her crew proved that all that training, all that preparation, all that dedication to excellence serves a purpose. When 6 lives hung in the balance over the North Atlantic Ocean, they were ready. The ceremony also recognized the contributions of the supporting aircraft crews. Lieutenant Colonel Barnes and Captain Thompson, who had piloted the C-130 tanker aircraft, received air medals for their roles in the aerial refueling operations that had made the rescue possible. The crews of the MC-130 communication aircraft and the ground support personnel who had coordinated the mission also received recognition. But perhaps the most meaningful moment of the ceremony came when Emma Harrison, the 7-year-old who had been the first survivor lifted from the life raft, approached Sarah with a drawing she had made. The crayon artwork showed a helicopter flying through storm clouds toward a small boat on rough seas. At the bottom, in a child's careful handwriting, were the words, "Thank you for saving my family." Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes as she looked at the drawing. This was why she had joined the military, why she had chosen a career that required her to risk her life for others. It wasn't about the recognition or the awards or the media attention. It was about moments like this, when a child could draw a picture of hope because someone had been willing to fly into a storm to save her life. The technical aspects of the mission had been thoroughly analyzed by Air Force safety officials, meteorologists, and aircraft engineers. The consensus was that the rescue had been conducted at the very edge of what was possible with current technology and human abilities. The weather conditions had been worse than initially reported, the fuel margins had been thinner than calculated, and the precision acquired for the rescue operations had exceeded normal training standards. The mission serves as a case study for what can be accomplished when exceptional people operate exceptional equipment under extraordinary circumstances, noted Colonel Patricia Stealth Jenkins, the Air Force's Director of Rescue Operations. But it also demonstrates the importance of thorough training, careful planning, and the willingness to take calculated risks when lives are at stake. The rescue had indeed pushed every element of the operation to its absolute limits. The HH-60G Pavehawk had operated in weather conditions beyond its normal parameters. The aerial refueling operations had been conducted in turbulence that would normally ground both aircraft. The rescue procedures had required precision timing and positioning that bordered on the impossible.
Most importantly, the human element had been tested to its breaking point. Sarah and her crew had made life or death decisions under extreme pressure, maintained their composure in conditions that would terrify most people, and executed complex procedures flawlessly while dealing with equipment operating at its limits. The story had resonated far beyond military aviation circles. Civilian rescue organizations had studied the mission to understand how similar operations might be conducted in extreme weather conditions. International military forces had requested briefings on the techniques and procedures used during the rescue. Aviation manufacturers had analyzed the performance of their equipment under the stresses encountered during the mission. But for Sarah, the lasting impact of the mission was more personal. She had discovered capabilities within herself that she hadn't known existed. She had pushed through barriers that she had thought were absolute limits. She had proven to herself and others that extraordinary achievements were possible when the stakes were high enough and the commitment was total. 3 weeks after the rescue, Sarah returned to her normal duties as a pilot in the 352nd Special Operations Wing. She flew training missions, participated in exercises, and prepared for deployments just as she had done before the North Atlantic rescue. But she carried with her the knowledge that when the ultimate test had come, she had been ready. The book that had started this entire adventure, Sun Tzu's The Art of War, sat on her desk in the pilot's lounge, open to the same page where she had left off 3 weeks earlier. But now, the ancient wisdom about warfare and strategy seemed less relevant than the lesson she had learned through direct experience, that sometimes the greatest battles come not from defeating enemies, but from saving lives. The impact of the rescue continued to ripple outward in ways that Sarah couldn't have anticipated. The story had inspired other military personnel to push themselves harder in training, knowing that lives might someday depend on their skills and courage. Young people had been motivated to pursue careers in military aviation, drawn by the example of service members willing to risk everything for strangers. Most importantly, 6 people continued to live their lives day after day because of decisions made and actions taken during a few hours over the North Atlantic Ocean. Dr. Michael Harrison continued his work as a cardiac surgeon, saving lives in operating rooms around London. Elena Harrison returned to her classroom, teaching international students and sharing her experience as a lesson about courage and hope. Emma and James Harrison grew a little taller each day, played with their friends, attended school, and gradually forgot the details of their ordeal while retaining an unconscious confidence that help would always come when they needed it most. Dr. Sarah Wright resumed her medical practice, perhaps treating her patients with a deeper appreciation for the fragility and preciousness of life. Captain Tommy McLeod eventually returned to flying, carrying with him a profound respect for the skills and dedication of military rescue crews. As Sarah reflected on the events of that extraordinary day, she realized that the rescue had been about more than just saving 6 lives. It had been about proving that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they were properly trained, adequately equipped, and completely committed to their mission.
It had demonstrated that the seemingly impossible became possible when human skill and determination were applied to well-designed technology and carefully planned operations. The North Atlantic rescue had become part of Air Force history, studied by future generations of pilots and rescue specialists. But for Sarah, it would always be personal, a reminder of what could be accomplished when someone was willing to close a book, stand up from a comfortable chair, and fly into a storm to save the lives of strangers. On quiet afternoons in the pilot's lounge when the base was peaceful and no emergency calls interrupted the routine of military life, Sarah would sometimes pick up her copy of The Art of War and continue reading from where she had left off. But now she understood that the most important battles weren't necessarily fought against human enemies. Sometimes they were fought against time, weather, distance, and the limitations of technology and human endurance. And sometimes, when you fought those battles with enough skill, courage, and determination, everybody won. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.